So we are back for episode 2 of The Evolution of Painting, where we're copying of Frans Hals. Thank you everyone for being here. Once again, I've been looking forward to this, and we will continue the painting. And first, let's prepare a little bit from where we were last week and what we're talking about. So we are copying 4 paintings: a Hals, a Rembrandt, a Velázquez, and a Vermeer. Plus, at the end, we'll visit Christine Lafuente and make a copy of one of her paintings. All of the paintings, the old master paintings we're copying, are from the 17th century. 3 of them are Dutch, which will become important as we talk about this. And all of them are some of my favorite paintings, as I said, as a student, visiting and talking about and thinking about these paintings was an all-consuming thing for me. These paintings shaped my understanding of painting and shaped my taste as an artist. Now, the theme that we're looking at underlying these 4 paintings and underlying this period in Western art is individualism. And I want to say a little bit more about that, and then we're going to look at some images very quickly before we start painting, just to get ourselves in the right frame of mind for appreciating Hals in relation to other artists of similar kind and other portrait painters. So individualism is an evolution of both art and philosophy and society in Western Europe. And I want to emphasize that because it is highly unique to the West, and in that period, the West, we're talking about Europe. So that if we think about the 17th century, we can name all kinds of artists. If we think about Western art in general, you and I can spend hours just reeling off names of artists that we know, from painters to poets to composers to sculptors. You know, lots of names of individual artists. If I asked you to do the same for Chinese or Japanese or Korean artists, I think we'd have a lot more trouble. And you might say, well, that's because we're not Japanese or Korean. I don't think so. It's not that simple. In the East, in the Orient, in Asia, the emphasis for artists and members of society is to serve the collective, to sacrifice analysis of the collective, analysis of the society, questioning of the society for that elevated experience of building a more cohesive society. Individualism has no emphasis in Asia, in the East. Much different in the West, where and I would say that if you were to ask probably a well-educated or even reasonably educated Chinese person, Japanese person, or Korean, if they could name some Western artists, I guarantee you they could. They could tell you who Shakespeare was and Mozart and Michelangelo and Raphael and etc. In the West, individualism is prized. And that has continued since the Renaissance right to our present day, where the most courageous thing you can do, the way to show off, is to wear a t-shirt that says "Question Authority." They would never do that in the East. And each has both its benefits and its costs, so that in the collective society, where everyone is dedicated to the collective, the individual must sacrifice their own personal misgivings, doubts, analysis, questionings of the larger collective. The benefit is that one is fully wedded into the collective and never has that feeling that we sometimes have in the West of being disenfranchised, of being isolated, of doubting the meaning of all this, because we have become so, the cost of that individualism is that feeling potentially of separation. Okay, so when we look at the paintings we're going to look at, I want to keep an emphasis and understanding on this theme of individualism, and particularly in relation to the 17th century, because in the 17th century, there is this unique way that the interests of the individual and the interests of society reach a kind of equilibrium that I don't think happened before or after that. okay? So that there is a moment here in the 17th century, and when I say a moment, I mean maybe 100 years, where the expression of art gives us the understanding of kind of having both, having our cake and eating it too, having the understanding of the unique individual in relationship to society without losing the cohesiveness of society. Again, very interesting, unique period. Okay, we'll talk more about that as we go along. And again, especially when we get to Rembrandt, are we going to talk about that in a very interesting way. And let me just say, at the end of the program, when we take the questions, I will tell you more about the sequence of the copying that we're going to do, which artist is first, second, third, etc. Okay, over the weeks. Now, the first thing I want to do is look at some Hals very quickly. So I'm going to screen share here with you. The lady with the fan, whose name we don't know. And what I'm going to do here is we're going to get these Hals paintings. I'm going to show you a small handful of Hals, then a small handful of Titians, then a small handful of Anthony van Dyck's, who was a portrait painter contemporaneous to Hals. And we're doing this so that you can get a little more specific, real understanding, you know, get it in our mind's eye, what's different about Hals from the others. Okay, one thing we have to remember is, again, this is a high water mark also, not just of individualism in painting, but of individualism in Dutch society. There's no monarch. The church has been, you know, toppled. The Protestantism is there. So there's no religious art really going on. All art now in Holland has become pretty secular, just to keep that in mind. Okay, so there's our girl.
Oh, yes.
Okay, good. So this is another Hals in the Met. Now this is very different. It's a man, of course, and it is also an unnamed portrait. And the reason I wanted to show you this one, because this one especially, I think, will compare to the Titians in that what we have here is a kind of man who is sort of representative of men in general, I'm going to say, by which he could be seen as not an everyman, but a man who is relatively handsome, but we want to see the immediacy of our engagement with him. He looks at us, and we also see that he is no aristocrat necessarily. He may be upper middle class, he may be upper class in terms of his income, but his dress does not reveal tremendous poetic possibilities, as we're going to see in the Titian. There is not, let me put it this way, there is no idealization. This is the man as he was, his full self, and even in that neutral expression, we see a great deal of engagement with us, and we can feel a lot of facets of his personality, of his character coming through. And we see also the tremendous immediacy to with the way the painting is executed, especially in the hair. Okay, that we copied. And we see here a man of a little bit younger age, but similar in many ways, you know, a kind of solid, sturdy, capable individual. But what we do see here, even though he looks at us, even though there is a direct engagement, so to speak, there is definitely an idealization to the way the components of the head are described, the kind of perfect rounded volumetric way of his hair, the perfect arcing curve of his beard, the perfect straightness of his nose, the perfect kind of arc to his nostril. These are ideals, very much coming from that kind of spirit of Greek sculpture, where you don't take the individual with all their little warts and all kind of representation. You have an idealized poetry about that. This is what human beings can be, less what this particular man was. He is an individual, but there is also something about him that is more broadly characteristic of mankind. Very famous Titian painting, very beautiful, lofty poetry about what a human being could be. I always think this looks like a portrait of Hamlet. It is an individual to be sure, and yet there is a way, one, he does not directly engage with us with his eyes, and also, even in his modest dress, there is a kind of idealized poetry. Something that is not so much just the immediate experience of, say, Titian being in the room with him. We can feel that Titian has filtered his experience of this man through a kind of loftier aesthetic. It's very profound, very beautiful, about an individual, but not an individual who is, I want to say, fully separated from the society in their relationship. And that goes not just for the sitter, but for Titian himself. Titian himself is still not questioning authority. He is serving whatever monarch or wealthy patron or person of nobility that he is serving them. Wow. Anthony van Dyck. This is very contemporaneous with Hals. We can see that Van Dyck is much more influenced by Titian. And let me say that Hals' teacher was a man named Karel van Mander, very cultivated, very much bringing Italian art and Italian theory, art theory to Holland at that time. And he, as I said, held up Titian as the model for the way artists should paint. And he said or proposed to his students that Titian had two ways of painting. One was a smoother way, and one was a more rugged way as Titian got older. And what we see, I think, here in the Van Dyck is that Titian smoother way of painting. Again, I'm absolutely not preferring one over the other, but we see this is very different than the Hals. Now we can feel, I started to say we can feel an engagement with her, but I couldn't finish the sentence. I'm not sure that I do. I feel that even as her eyes meet ours, she is very removed from us. She is a member of, whether it's aristocracy and or nobility, it's also, she is brought to us through an aesthetic which is not wanting to provide us with that immediate engagement. And I would say, looking at her portrait here, this is not a criticism of Van Dyck, anything I say, I know nothing about her, nothing. I know that she's young, I know that she's beautiful, I know that she comes from nobility, but I know nothing and feel nothing of the facets of her personality or her character. This is one more Titian that I wanted to put out because I think this one is very intriguing in this whole conversation about Hals being different from other painters and the model that Titian sets. So this portrait is called, the sitter's name is Ranuccio Farnese. He was nobility, he was 13 years of age when this was painted, so the history books say. And again, what we see here is most definitely an individual, and what we see here is a strikingly beautiful portrait. I just love this painting. It's in the National Gallery in Washington. But again, what we see here is almost what this is, the 13-year-old who will be nobility, who will have to take on the responsibilities of aristocracy and maybe being a ruler of some sort. Zoom in on his head here. Beautifully charming and just profoundly lofty in its poetry about the beauty of a human head, the beauty of a human being, the human animal, so to speak. But again, I don't feel that I know anything about Ranuccio Farnese looking at this. I must insist, I am not criticizing Titian for saying that. All I'm pointing out to is not one painting being better than another, but the difference in the kinds of poetry, in the differences in the philosophy of presenting an individual. This is another Van Dyck, and I think this comes very close, or should come very close, to the experience of looking at a Hals. She's directly engaged with us. The painting has a feeling of, it's just her and us in the room, and she's looking straight at us. Very individualized in terms of the facial features. There's no idealization of, excuse me, changing her appearance for us. But you see the difference in the way it's painted. So let's talk about the hair. Remember in the Hals where I was saying how the hair was so vigorously just zapped in. Here the hair is presented differently, very beautifully. The color is just gorgeous. The transitions that give us the softness of the curls, very beautiful. That deep auburn next to the paleness of her skin, all this wonderfully beautiful. But we feel that she is filtered through an aesthetic which, even as she looks at us, keeps her on the other side of a divide from us. I don't think that the Hals do. We are on the same side of the experience as the individual in the Hals. To start with here is the area surrounding the head. Let me bring up my example. So we're going to start first with the background. And here. We're going to start with the background because the background really is part of the light mass. So let's revisit a little bit about what we did last time on the painting itself. You remember we started with a ground that we can still see in places, this kind of, let's call it cream coffee ground. And the purpose for that ground was so that immediately the darks had their deep resonance and the lights were floating on top of that darker ground. So immediately we had the capacity to fully understand on this ground how our lights and our darks were functioning. And that's important because remember, we're just marching through this as Hals would. He doesn't want, there's no planned layering effect in a Hals. He's immediately going after what he wants. Even as it takes some building, he's still trying to react immediately to the model, not that something is going to happen later. Okay, so we got that. Let me get my palette. Now, remember that with the Hals, coming from the Titian, coming from the Greeks, essentially coming from sculpture, that's the way this is moving, you know, from sculpture to painting is the way art is evolving, individual expression in art is evolving, that once painting arrives, sculpture is definitely a secondary art. It just is, because painting gives it so much more capability than sculpture does. However, the painters, such as Titian, and those who are influenced by him, are still very inspired by the fundamental significance of sculpture. So when we look at the Hals, we have a very sculptural effect, and as we said last week, to some extent, even an architectural significance to this columnar sort of presentation of the portrait subject. All right, so we are going to continue now. Oh, in terms of talking about the sculpture, what I was going to get at, was that my palette is extremely restricted, extremely, I want to say, use the word compressed. I don't think of it as narrow. I don't feel that it's a deprivation. On the contrary, it's a matter of seeing how much I can wring out of a very few colors by thinking of them in a fundamental way. That fundamental way is in terms of our primaries. Red, yellow, and blue have to be brought out everywhere or somewhere within the painting. We must have some presence of all three primaries. And in my case, the only blue I have, well, the most significant blue I have is ivory black. My red is transparent oxide red, which is really a burnt yellow. And then I have yellow ochre and white. So yellow ochre, transparent oxide red, black, and white. All right. So now so that means that when we look at her, the color experience is not broad, but everything we need is present. Vivid color could, probably would, potentially start to dissipate the significant experience of the sculptural effect within the painting. Okay? All right, enough said. All right, let's go to our background here. Is that what we want to do? I'm thinking what I would like to do before I go to the background even is to achieve some of the darkest darks in her hat and her jacket, I'm going to call it. And so I'm going to take a little bit of my ivory black. I'm going to add just a tiny bit of white. And I want the dark darks because the dark darks give complement to the brightest lights. So I'm going to start up here in her little cap. I don't know what the heck you call those things. Oh, that helped a lot. So right away, we see two things. That we are acknowledging the darkest dark. That is now the darkest moment in the entire painting. It gives relationship to my lights. And it also, this black has a little bit of white in it. I don't want to be transparent anymore. I don't think I'm not planning to paint transparently anymore, anywhere. Everything I do will have at least, a tiny fleck of white in it, which is what this black has, the tiniest fleck of white in it. All right, so I'm getting the shape of her little chapeau. And the darks can be painted much less densely than the lights. Okay, that was good. I like that. That gave some relationship to my lights. And I'm just going to do likewise in her jacket. I want to get the dark darks established, which makes me think of another thing I wanted to restate here early and often, which is that when I'm working, I am not thinking of developing features. I am thinking of developing themes, because themes give us analogy, okay? Which is another way of saying themes give us melody and harmony in this case. So we did all the darks first, the theme of the darks, and we saw the analogy between different darks to each other. Then we did all of the lights, and we looked for analogy, harmony between those different lights, okay? Now we're going back to the theme of the lights, but they are the dark features within the lights, okay? So we're looking for the harmony and the analogy in the theme of the darks and the lights. Very important that I do not think that I'm painting features. It's got to be a little blacker than that. I put too much white in there, don't I? And I want to take opportunity to put the paint on, what do I want to say? Vigorously thinly, okay? So I'm taking advantage of these dark darks to put virtually a wash on, something that allows me to take a long, fluid stroke with the brush to engage with my medium in a way that the darks underneath provide. So that sepia that I put there last week now allows me the opportunity to paint very thinly on top. Okay, the same things happen? Yes, yes, yes. Okay, and I want to do this throughout. Exploring just shape and dark. Okay. Sorry about my squeaky easel again. All right. Now out here, I must admit, I've sacrificed making these blacks quite opaque. Another famous artist who was a big fan of Hals was Van Gogh. And Van Gogh supposedly wrote to his brother that he had determined that Frans Hals used 27 different blacks. And I'm not sure whether he meant, I'm sure he didn't mean blacks out of the two, but that just makes me laugh at the idea of spending time counting the blacks. All right. Artists are a crazy bunch. Now, we're going to go to the background. Now, the background is in the light, and more or less, it is a relatively darkish feature. And I want to have you pay close attention to that. So if you bring up the image of our model on your computers, just take a close look at the background now, because in all Hals portraits, the background is extremely important, because it's almost all completely neutral. But that doesn't mean that you can phone that in. It doesn't mean that you have, that's not a place where the artist pays very careful attention. It's still a component of the composition that demands a lot of attention, and Hals does it brilliantly. He gets away with whatever he wants every time, and if you look carefully in many Hals portraits, the brush strokes in the background are every bit as opportune for their expression as anything he does in the head. It's really brilliant. Okay, so I'm going to start around the head and start building some of those lighter kind of cream coffees that we see up there. I'm going to zoom in on her a little bit. So in looking at the Hals, I came across a quote this week that I thought was so wonderful. It's the idea that within, I should keep painting here, that within a great work of art, we experience all points of the universe. And I thought, boy, is that true in the head of a Frans Hals portrait. Whenever I look at just the head of a Frans Hals portrait, I feel like I'm experiencing the moment where there's the coming together of all points of the universe. And I think of that too when I look at the background. There is a way that I feel that there's an expression of the cosmos and the way he does that. These are the kind of things I think about when I look at a painting. All right, now I want to get this right. The background. Okay, so then the question immediately comes up, well, why did I start there? And I can start the background any darn where. Why did I start there? Because the background is the presentation of her. It is the present, its first and foremost function is to deliver the center of the cosmos here. And so I'm going to start next to her. Here I felt I had the most contrast, and so that's why I began there. How's that going? So you can see it's not dramatic what's happening, but it is very important. Okay. Good, we set that head. It's very beneficial now to see opaque color in the background next to opaque color in the head. So very important that everything I'm doing here has white in it. And I can see that that's very subtle in what you're seeing. Which to some extent is, of course, what we would expect, since when I put this on, the transparency from last week, of course, I was I was reacting to what I saw in the reference, the painting. Now, I am going to go ahead and actually include a little yellow ochre in what I'm doing here, because I feel that I want kind of what I was saying earlier, sort of all aspects of my primaries to have some presence in the background as well as in the head. Okay. So he seems to have a little bit of glow around her. And if you look at your original, you can see that there's a kind of way that he seems to be having the background occur very much in relation to her. So he doesn't conceive of the background as a backdrop. He considers the background as a presentation of her contours and of light and dark. All right. So you see some of the strokes in the background run exactly parallel to her, and you can just feel him sort of caressing the contour of the figure with the stroke of the background. And in that sense, I'm not even going to take the background all the way out as we're working here now for the sake of time. Or am I? What time is it? Let's see. Okay, it does get darker out here. So basically, most of the strokes in the background I've taken have black, transparent oxide red, and white in them, every single stroke so far. And now I am looking to get what we might call a kind of rough-hewn character to the background. Well, that's good. So I don't want it to be smooth. I want it within in the background to have example of or evidence of the nature of oil paint. And I wanted to have evidence of the brush, of the artist's hand. How are we doing here? I'm going to go a little bit further out, and then I'll decide if we want to go back to the figure itself. We got a lot of work to do in the hands. All points of the universe. I love that. Okay, so now we're starting to see that very subtle separation between the color of her jacket and her cap and the background. Good, good, good. And she seems to be getting more sculpturally, what do I want to say? A sculptural tension to her figure, to the column of her, is starting to be more in evidence. Now, at times, I don't mind if even this transparent layer sort of comes through, because that is evidence, as I was saying, of the medium. So remember, we want it to be rough and rugged. So getting back to what I was saying a few minutes ago, that Hals' teacher talked to his students about Titian being the example to follow for what great portraiture is. And he talked to them, presented to them the idea that there is a rough style and a smooth style. And the interesting thing was that Hals' teacher was an advocate of the rough style, but he wanted his students, he instructed them to first learn the smooth style, because he said the rough style was much more difficult. I thought that was interesting. And it is true that Titian himself did not paint in a rougher style until late in his career. But we want the rough style here. So how are we doing? We're getting there. Okay, so I'm going to stop this background, that is, because I feel that there's a limit to how much you can see what I'm doing on the Zoom platform. Okay, gang. So what I'm going to do now is move in and paint on the head and this a little bit. And to set that up, I'm going to mute myself. And I'm going to do that because My easel is very squeaky, and I was told that's not very pleasant for you all. So let me just mute myself. If you want to run to the restroom, whatever, it'll probably take me 1 or 2 minutes to just get myself set up to work on the head and her collar, okay? Okay, gang, we're back, and that looks, I think, pretty good. Okay, let me make a little adjustment here. Okay. So set down some of my larger brushes here. All right. Okay, so let's take a quick assessment here. What we have is the blocking in of the light mass against or in relation to that cream coffee ground. The cream coffee ground is still functioning as the lesser lights, although they'll get brighter still. So what we started with was the shapes of light, giving us the sculptural form in the head even before we have any description of detail. We emphasized last week that capturing and having an evidence at all time that beautiful subtle expression was of critical importance. And so I think that is there, and we want that because that is a big part of the inspiration of the picture, a big part of the inspiration for the artist in conveying the individuality of this woman. Okay, all that seems to be going pretty well. What we see here also is at least my nature, if not Frans Hals' nature, although I think it is, which is what was known as open form draftsmanship. So that I have not described her so much in terms of confirming her contours. I have described her sort of from the inside of the light mass outward, so that by finding the shape of this light and building outward and finding the shape of that light on the cheek and building outward, I have essentially achieved a likeness structurally that is not dependent on contours. Contours will result from what I'm doing. They are not the first step, okay? Just an interest. All right, so let's see what we can do here. I want to go back where I began and left off last week, which is in those brightest lights in the forehead. And I would like to imagine now that for the sake of our exercise, I want to imagine that I'm pursuing completion. Oh, that was good. So I took advantage of my strong contrast of the light on the forehead next to the dark of her cap to just get a spark. And I'm going here now to the center of the forehead. I'm going to take that out a little bit. Now, one stroke that I took there, that stroke just a moment ago started to scumble, to drag over the surface. I could do that, but Hals would never do that. And it's not important that I am fully faithful to the way he does it, as we've talked about in other episodes. I can do it my way, but I want to also make sure that I'm exploring his way. Okay, good. So we got a little more volume to that forehead. And what we also got is an immediate spark of life to the painting. It seems slightly bright, but I got away with it. Okay, I want to go back and see if I can't find the absolute center of that bone structure in her forehead. If you look at the original, there's two lights right there and there that are the absolute brightest lights. And by finding those, I'm finding specificity within that forehead to show the subtlety of that bone structure. And that is not for the purpose of anatomical correctness. It is for the purpose of showing the nature of the subject matter. Okay, how are we doing? Not bad. Okay, now I want to continue what I'm doing. And what I'm doing was not just painting the forehead, I am painting the theme of the bright lights. And I want to find these bright lights along the bridge of the nose to find a similar, hopefully, kind of spark that was just brought into the forehead, and in that sense, into the whole of the head. That was okay. I want it a little bit brighter. Now, the thing that I immediately notice about the Hals is how various his brush work is. Oh, that was good. Okay, now let's get that bright highlight on the end of the nose. That was okay. I'm going to go down. So what am I doing? I'm painting thematically, not features. I'm going to all those brightest lights. The next one is in the philtrum, right there. That is common to this, and here. This is just a little nudge, but that little nudge is important. Good. Okay, now what? Now we've got to consider the cheeks. I'm also wanting to consider her eyes. I'm also knowing that real soon I'm going to need the eyebrows, and I think that is now. Is that correct? Let's try. Let's see what happens if we do a little description in the eyebrows. Now, that's intriguing to me that I'm wanting to go there because they are not part of the theme of those bright lights that I was just doing. I don't think. Let's see. Got to be a little lighter there. So we'll know immediately whether I chose the right place to work or not. Didn't hurt. Okay, we got to paint there. I keep wondering if I should take this out, continue this light on the forehead outward. That's certainly structural. There's a little piece of structural light there that I want. I know from experience that the shapes of these lights and the corners here of the socket are very important to likeness. And in her case, I'm expecting that it might be important to expression as well. That was okay. Now I'm wondering about the whites of the eyes. When the heck should I do those? So I'm also thinking to myself, okay, look for brevity in how I do this because of wanting to get there sooner than later. Okay, maybe I'm overthinking it. I want to do that side of the nose. I want this. And I'm expecting that I'll go from here to here. That both of those are lights that are neither fully bright. Well, they're not fully bright. They are kind of half lights. Boy, this is, so I'm expecting that this one is not going to be towards the red and not towards the blue. So the lip is our reddest moment in terms of our primaries. And then the rest of the features, at least in this reproduction, are very hard to read for some of these distinctions. But I'm going to just move that side of the nose into a definitely more neutral character. Not bad. Good. Shape goes up in there, comes down to there, and I want to bring these together. Okay, that was all right. Now that immediately makes me realize that this got too dark. Good. Okay, we're gonna get some lights there, but not just yet. Okay, now I want this and that. And of these two, the two sides of the bridge of the nose, the left side is brighter. We're gonna do that first. Always going from brighter to less bright. Now this one, I would expect to be somewhat more towards the cooler end of our primaries. Good. So in other words, it's possible that this is a relative blue. Also good. Now we go back to the right side of the bridge of the nose. That is, so I compare what's here to what's there. No room for error. Okay, now what? So I look, what's the subtle difference between this and this? Very little. Good, 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 good. Okay, now I'm thinking, do I want to go back and strike the lights on the bridge of the nose a little bit more? The answer is yes. So right here, it's got to get just a tad brighter. Very neutral. Very melodic. Ah, that was not bright enough. So my new word that I want to keep using is analogy. I read that recently in terms of these things. So I'm finding analogy between these various bright lights. That was not great, but I'm going to have to leave it. Let's come out here. So we are looking for that larger phenomenon of form. So as these lights start to turn away from the form, they diminish in brightness. I'm very, very specific about my language. They do not get dark, at least not yet. That was good, wasn't it? Pretty much. Let's try something right in there. Boy, he did that well. Jesus. Okay, good. Okay, let's go up to, so I started all this with the eyebrow, and I want to go back there, even though, do I? Let me go out here just a little bit. I want that similarly, the way this rolls out, I want this to roll out, then I got to punch these lights a little bit brighter. That reflected light's going to be a lot of fun. And I'm also thinking it probably wouldn't hurt to emphasize a couple or three bright moments in her collar area to show how the presence of white influences our understanding of the complexion of the face. Okay, I want to let those temple areas get real sophisticated. My first thought is they're kind of like the background. You know, here we have the red, the black, and the yellow, and the white all involved in this. That's too dark. Just like in the background, I was saying that I had the red, the black, and the white, and that was an aesthetic strategy. Oh, that was good. Oh, that was so beneficial. Oh, that was so helpful. Why was that helpful? Because that is now the yellowest place in the head. And as soon as that golden color took place, all of the reds just stood up and said, here I am. You know, because they are different than that yellow. The cheek, the lip, the little moments of blush anywhere else in the painting suddenly had reference in that gold. What a relief. And what a discovery. Would I have known that just looking at the painting? Maybe, but in copying it and experiencing it, it is forever mine as a joyous learning experience. Let's come out here. That is why we copy. Now I gotta be careful not to get too dark there. And I gotta be careful not to get greedy about that yellow either. It has to stay as a kind of, it's too dark. It has to stay, that one has to come off. It has to stay a specialty item because it is not present in the same quantities as the reds, the red side of our primaries in the portrait head. Let me try this, cross our fingers. That was a little blunt. Okay, I don't want to get too caught up in that forehead. Let me see if we can just take our fan brush and smack that. Okay, now I will say that what I just did using the fan brush, you can see that in finished Hals paintings. He doesn't try to hide it one bit. He shows absolutely and leaves the evidence of the fan brush in place. And he does so because it is evidence of the, what do I want to say, the construction of the painting. And it is evidence, okay, we're gonna have to just leave that. I'm not crazy about it. And it is evidence of the nature of the texture of oil paint. Okay, good. Move on. Let's go down here. So you see the way thematically this transition, and this transition are analogous. And that's a real beauty down there in that cheek. And isn't this a moment where we can expect, dare I say it, to get a lot of her expression because there is that lifting of the cheek. Okay, so where do we want to start? I think we got to build from the light outward. If I jump right there, I'm not going to get direct progress. I'll show you what I mean. Okay, got a high bar set here. Let me see. Could be worse. It wasn't quite bright enough. Let me see here. Okay, I'm going to build out there to the right. No, I'm not. I'm going to take a stroke underneath the stroke I just took because it transitions downward as well as to the right. And down here, there's a lot, right in here we get yellow, red, blue. That was successful. Let's go to, then it gets a little more blush out here, brighter than this, but just barely, so musical. That is such a beautiful moment of shape, a beautiful moment of value, a beautiful moment of color in his. Not so much there, but in his. Got away with it, sort of. I'm going to really have to go back and get the little moments of expression where they occur in order to get this baby back up in flight. Now, let's do what I was saying a moment ago. Let's do a little bit of the whites in the collar. So especially, it's the same thing. Whenever I go to an area of the painting to work on, the first thing I do is go after the brightest light. So if I look at the collar, there's certainly a bright light here, but I feel that this one is more important, and that's a really ratty brush. I'm not going to use it. Let me see here. All right, and it takes, so this is not straight white, and it's just a moment, and just because I think Hals wants this to be something that doesn't appear too bluish, it is only relatively blue. I'm taking a little bit of my sepia off of my palette and introducing it into this color, which otherwise would seem to be just white. That didn't make much difference. I'll try again. Okay, that was pretty good. And what I liked about that is two things. It had an effect, but that effect was subtle. It didn't, suddenly, what do I want to say, undo any of the things I just spent so long doing. Okay, let's take a stroke across the top of the near collar, right here. And this is all these strokes are for the surface of the head. Okay. Okay, good. You can see that. All right, good. Now, because I don't want, this is a broad passage. The shape of this light, the scale of the shape of this light is important to the smaller scales of the brushwork and the strokes in the head. So I don't want to leave this just a stroke like that. I want to show that this is one broad area of light because its scale and shape are as important as how bright it is. All right, that was too blue. Got to be brighter. I'm really happy that these are not jumping. Not bad. I don't want it to sit there quite like that. That's okay. Let's try right there, there, there. That was beneficial. Okay, now we need to, because as we're going now, we need to have this develop opaquely. I need to actually do a little bit of these secondary lights in here too. That one was a little too bright. So the lights on the inside of the collar are still, well, they are almost like a shadow. Drat, that was not working. That was better. Now, there's a way in which the upper part of the inside of the collar is not gray. It's not black. This is like sepia with a little white in it. Oh, that was helpful. Okay, now, right here, if you zoom in on the head, you can see there's a stroke of like an aura of light emanating from the collar behind her chin that he's he's creating very specifically as warmer than these lights. So that is, again, like an aura, like something that is both the collar behind her chin and the influence of the flesh colors in the chin. Now I've built it up. Let me see if I can do this. Yeah, I don't want it to get too warm. Let me see here. Come on now. Good. Okay, it's got to be a little bit lighter when it goes to the right there. This is hugely important. And I'm going to tell you why in just a second. Okay, remember when I was doing the side of her arm with the background, and I said what he was doing there was to give tension to the contours to emphasize their sculpture. That's what's happening right here too. It's going to happen here, it's going to happen here. So that to him, the moment where those two things come together are just the most fabulous opportunity. That was a little too bluish. Good. Okay. Can you see? See, to me, all that stuff was of tremendous, by painting the collar, the head was developed, even though I didn't touch the head in the last 5 minutes. It's a miracle. All right, let's go to getting this collar up a little bit higher. Paper got in my way, a little blunt, that's okay. All right, now what? Now, based on that, getting back to our new word analogy, I want to see how the whites of her eyes are analogous with the collar. Not so much this one, but this one. Okay, so I'm going to go to the white, the sclera on her, the eye on our right. It is definitely not as bright or cool as the collar. Let's see here. And I don't think I want the entirety of the sclera, do I? I think I want to just emphasize this right next to the iris. We're going to find out. Now this is absolutely extremely demanding in terms of drawing. Okay, let's go across this way. Is that okay? It's going to have to be. Let's go to, I'm going to add a little more white to the brush to get the framing of the iris. There. Is that okay? I think. Now, because of that, so when I did that sclera, I was simultaneously describing the iris. And in that regard, I now have to have the description of the iris out to the right here. And that's mostly, or quite a lot, about description of the immediacy of where she's looking. I have to admit this stroke is completely exploratory. That was too dark. Boy, come on now. That was sort of neither bad nor good. Let's try the sclera on the other side. And again, all this, the most significant part of this effort is to shape the direction of the gaze. That was a little more reassuring. That was better. Much better. Okay, good. The two eyes together are working in a more cohesive way. And now I can imagine drawing in lashes, crease of lid, underside of lid, and all that is linear sword play, which we're not going to do yet. Let's go back to those eyebrows. And the eyebrows also constitute this and this. So right now, as soon as I took that stroke, well, I want to come out here very soon, but before that, I want this. I want to work from that interior of the light mass of the head outward. This modeling of the bony structure in here is so beautifully sculptural. Those are some wonderful neutral colors. Let's see what we can do here. Cross our fingers. That was okay. Now let's go to the one on our right. So you see right here, we have to go from center of the bridge of the nose out into the socket and respect the fact that the eyebrow happens above that. This has to flow into there. There's one little moment there. This, dare say it, should not be terribly difficult. Of course, that made me screw it up. We have to go back and get that bright light inside that. I don't want to try to wipe away. Let me just see, come on now. I think that center brow here, the light here, is one of the places in the head where we definitely have the yellow end of our spectrum in evidence. Right. Okay. We'll live to fight another day on that one. Let's go out to this contour. Okay, now we want to model that cheek, and that should really be significant in terms of confirming the sculptural effect in the head. Okay, my alarm's going off telling me I've been talking a long time. Let's keep going here. Let's get that. So what we have over here is sometimes cap, sometimes hair, just like the aura down here. It's both the collar and her chin. Out here, it's both her hair and the cap. So I'm mixing something that's almost like one of my dark background colors. It has both the black, or all three, black, yellow, and transparent oxide red in it. Definitely some white. The slope of her forehead is a very beautiful thing. Let's see here. I think that's a good start. Let's try. I don't like that broken edge though, darn it. So I made the stroke a little more fluid and I try again. Boy, that was risky because I don't want to carve too much into my forehead. Okay, as it comes down to her temple, we have theme and variation. It gets a little bit blacker as we come down into here. And widens out and comes back in. Oh, that was pretty good. Okay, now I see that there is opportunity to take another stroke in between that dark stroke I took in the light of the forehead, which is a slightly less dark, warm stroke. Get a narrow brush over here. So just about another 5 minutes, gang, and then we'll do the questions. Okay, what do we got here? Good. Okay. Now we got to do here. I can't decide whether to take the flesh of the cheek out further. I think we're going to have to, but that's going to have to, then the dark will have to come in and meet it. But we've got to have the light first. As always, the light has to come first. So I go back. I see that there is a more blushed moment right there, brighter blush up here. And when I say blush, I'm talking about right at the contour. Let's see what this looks like. This is sort of, that was not bad. We could do that again down here. Sometimes you eat the bear. Okay, that got a little clumsy. And when I say of myself that that last stroke was a little clumsy, that is the thing. That was too dark. I will invite you, if you ever, when you see again Frans Hals paintings in person, the man never struggles, never. Everything is just perfectly within his capacity to do it. You know, I think of hearing Jascha Heifetz play the violin, and you feel like the violin is just at his mercy. With Hals, I feel like he does with oil paint whatever he wants, and it never talks back to him. Okay, not bad. Let's get a little bit in the chin here. This bright light here, that was too dark. Good, good, good. Okay. Let me see what we're doing time-wise here. 11:24, I got 5 more minutes. Let's keep going, let's keep going. Where can we get something most profitable? Okay, I don't want this raggedness here, even though that is a gentle transition. So that what we just did here, we've got a little more to do. I want to go back to the eyebrows. This basically, I started to think, well, why the heck do I want to do this? Because this collar is part of this theme of the contours of the left side of the figure meeting the background. Sometimes that's her head, sometimes it's her collar. And I'm going to mix, and I want to go after it because the way he solves that is with this warm glow that I just want to see what we can do here. Good. Try going down below with a little bit brighter. Neither bad nor good. Let me see. Okay, now, just like up here, I put the dark of her cap and then the light of her cheek, and then I made a stroke. I have one more stroke to do there. There's a dark, dark stroke just to the left of her collar there. Okay, all right. Now, I said, and I meant what I said, that I was going to draw that dark, warm contour there. What goes on right here is important and has to be done first. That is something that, again, is one of those moments that is both collar and head. Now it's got to get lighter underneath that. Good. Okay, now I want to shape the front of her neck just a tiny bit. That didn't hurt. Trying to think of where to go next. There's various possibilities. Let's, I don't want to go after the seduction of that reflected light too soon, although boy, it really is seductive. Let me do right above the collar. This is a stroke rather ambiguous in its coloration that I'm asking myself, did that really have purpose? I think so. Not bad. Okay, let me see here. Okay, gang, so tell you what, we're gonna pause there because it is 11:30. I'll take some of your questions and we'll talk about what we're gonna do next. So I'm gonna mute you again while I disrupt our setup here, the squeaky setup. Hold on, give me one. Okay, all. So hopefully that was informative and entertaining simultaneously. I'll show her a little bit of this one. So my plan had been to get further than we did this week, and then next week we would just have a slideshow talking about Hals and comparing him to various other contemporaries. Now I'm thinking we're going to do both. So we're going to take the painting further, whether we get finished or not. Next week will be the last time we work on this painting, and the class hopefully will be sort of roughly divided half and half between working on the painting and looking at slides of Hals and Rembrandt and then Dyck, and going further and seeing a lot more Hals examples and seeing some of his best paintings and talking about what makes them each one exceptional. There is, of course, that common theme of the individual and the immediacy and the finding completeness without idealization, which is so unique to Hals. And yeah, we'll do some of both. Okay, so now I'm ready for questions. If you have a question, I'm going to leave everybody muted, and if you have a question, just unmute yourself to ask it.
You know, Paul, you said something about him. He has two ways of painting, the smooth and the rough. Is the rough kind of scumbling over your painting, you know, like you did with the background?
That would be one example of it, yes. So that the backgrounds in Hals can be extremely rough, extremely vigorous, and extremely full of a kind of an attack with the brush. So what I was saying was that it's not so much that Hals has two styles. He's pretty consistent, although later Hals become extremely vigorous, and the brushwork gets bolder and bolder and more of a kind of roughly sculpted kind of thing, although when they get to that point, sculpting isn't quite the right word, but a very vigorous application. So what I was talking about was in the time of when Hals was a student, his teacher was a man named Carl van Mander, who was the kind of big gun in Dutch art theory and art education. And he was saying that there are two ways of proceeding in terms of painting. One is a smoother effect and one is a rougher effect. And he was saying that to his students that they should start with the smoother effect because it was less difficult. You had to sort of graduate to the rougher effect. And that tends to be true if you look at a lot of artists' personal evolution. If you look at Titian, the paintings when he's younger, like that man with a blue sleeve, are not rough at all. They're not ruggedly painted. And most of the examples I think I just showed you of Titian's are not ruggedly painted. But when you see late Titians, they get extremely rugged. He's ferocious in the way he paints them. And it's a very devil-may-care kind of way of doing it, that he has found himself and he defines what a painting will be. Hals kind of starts off right off from the get-go with this way of painting very roughly, and he is, I can't think, and I would say that if you were to propose the most brilliant example of painting in this rougher style, Hals would be one of those you would look at. And he does that throughout his career pretty much.
Thank you.
I have a question, Paul.
Mm-hmm.
Could you elaborate a little bit more on when you referred to that expression of when you looked at the head, the all points of the universe statement? Could you elaborate on that a little bit? I'm not quite sure what you mean.
Yeah, that's a hard one to elaborate on. So what that means...
Philosophically, I think that's a philosophical approach you're talking about.
I'm talking about a poetic, the verbalizing of a poetic experience, of an imaginative experience. So that, what does great art do? It connects us, not only to each other, but to every part of creation. And how that is going to happen is a very mysterious thing. So that, and I want to say it's something unique to painting, but that I have to think about. So that what I'm saying is to look at, for me, almost any Frans Hals head, the portrait head, to engage with that is to feel that in looking at that, it's not just an expression of this one person's head. It's an expression of a connection to everything. The universe, the cosmos, the mystery of creation, the tragedy of life, the joy of life, all of it right there. I don't feel that with most other portrait painters. There's several that I do. There are many great portrait painters, but with Hals, I really feel it's every time. And I don't expect everyone else to share that experience, but when I read this about, it was, the writer was talking about something else. But as soon as he said it, I thought, that's it. That's how I feel when I look at a Hals portrait, that the son of a gun gets the entire universe in a head. That's a wild thing. And the interesting thing about Hals is that that's all he paints, portraits. There are no Frans Hals landscapes, still lifes, figures, nudes, religious paintings, nothing, just portraits. So that I think is testimony to it. So granted, we can say, well, this is how the guy made a living. He's got to do them. But he could have done other things. Everything he does has heads in it. There are some sort of genre scenes, but they're kind of like portraits too, really. So what that says to me is that for Hals too, this painting heads is just inexhaustible. He never gets tired of it. He keeps finding it again and again. Every time he engages with it, he's never bored, never shows up as that. And we could tell if he was disinterested. Never does that happen. It happens in other great portrait painters. You can see this one, for whatever reason, they weren't feeling it that day. I never feel that with Hals. So that he himself is finding the most complete, fully satisfying and gratifying experience in doing that, in just painting a head. I mean, he paints the whole portrait and he engages that way with everything, but you know, this is what gets him rolling, gets him moving, has him fully engaged. And that's what I meant when I said, I think I was taking it as a quote from Whistler, that Hals is the equivalent of the Greeks in terms of sculpture, in that, you know, when we see, for me, if you see the greatest of Greek sculpture, I feel that same thing, like I'm being connected with all points of the universe. And that's true of, you know, many great works of art, music, poetry, sculpture, architecture, etc. But I thought that that quote, it just resonated with me as my experience of the Halls, that the mystery, the joy, the tragedy of creation is all there in a portrait. Another question?
There are questions in the chat. Can you see them? Would you
Yeah,
like
let me
me
see
to?
here. Could you give the titles of the paintings you reviewed this morning? I don't know all their titles. The canvas size I'm working on is 32 by 42. The colors in the background, as I said, were all 4 of the colors I was using: a transparent oxide red, yellow ochre, ivory, black, and white. And Mindy asked what I can mean by rough style. The rough style is, so if you remember the Van Dyck I showed you, maybe we should go back to that. Let's see if we can go back to that real quick, because I think this is the perfect answer to this question. Can you see the Van Dyck now?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So this, to answer your question, Mindy, the rough style is the opposite of this Van Dyck. And the Van Dyck is beautiful, absolutely stunning, but it is not roughly painted at all. It is very much, I'm going to say smoothly painted, and I don't mean that in any pejorative way. It is, if you look at her head, if you look at her features, everything is modeled to an extent where the brushwork is not clearly evident.
Okay.
It is evident somewhat in some cases, but there is a way that this is using the paint to express a different kind of mystery, or express the mystery of making a painting in a different way. So once again, in showing you the examples here, I am not saying Hals is better than this. It's to focus what I mean when I say Hals is tremendously unique and different. So that Van Dyck, the Van Dyck here that we're looking at, is very much more like the Titian, except that even with the Van Dyck, this woman is more individualized than Titian would have painted her, because this is coming 100 years after Titian. So the individualism is still developing here in the Van Dyck, but he's doing it with a different kind of finish than Hals is doing it. And perhaps because the subjects in the Van Dycks, again, are aristocracy, nobility, you know, there's an arm's length quality between us and them. Or let me put it this way. I feel with the Van Dyck subjects that there is a divide between me and them. This is not a bad thing. It's just the way it happens, the way it occurs. When I look at the Hals, there is no divide between me and the subject. Okay. And getting back to some of that is due to the brushwork, so that the Hals, especially if you look at that one, Mindy, if you go back, if you Google Van Dyck, for example, and you look at the way he paints hair, it's very beautiful. If you look at the way Hals paints hair, it is all about this, just zapping it in there. Just, you know, he's just going at it hammer and tongs when he puts in the hair and expressing the hair, but not as an idealization. Again, I think that's the way to think of it, that for Hals, as beautiful as his paintings are, as profound as they are, he is never idealizing his subject matter.
I was thinking of the contrast between, say, not Vermeer, who am I thinking of? Okay,
Velasquez?
no, I'm thinking of somebody I copied once, and it's geez, Ong, Ong versus Sargent. Like,
Oh,
think of Sargent as, would you say he's rough, but rougher form, or
yes, yes.
more, you see the brush stroke. It's much more lively, whereas Ong is, you don't see anything. There's no, the surface is completely smooth. And again, I would say idealized. I can see that.
Absolutely, big time. That's a perfect example. Perfect example. So that
Okay.
is very much about contour. So
Yeah.
he starts with the contour and then works inside it. Maybe not sequentially, but that's the way his imagination works. Okay. So again, with the Hals and myself and I'm working from inside out. The Angras work from contour in, very, very polished, very stunning, beautiful things. But absolutely, there is a distance between us and that subject matter, those people. The Sargent is probably the closest ancestor to Hals and the closest relative period of anybody to Hals is Sargent. And Sargent is not idealizing his subjects either, not really. And even though he is British, so I mean, he's painting in England, so he definitely is an ancestor to Van Dyck also. But he's definitely wanting to paint a kind of illusionism that is unorthodox. And we're going to talk a lot more about Sargent when we get to Velasquez.
Okay. Thanks.
Because they're also very closely related.
Great.
Paul, I think it is my understanding that Sargent actually idealized most of the people he painted, which led to his successfulness as a painter, because he made everybody look just a little bit better than they did. And that was how he became such a popular and successful portrait artist of his time.
Well, there is something to that. So when I said he didn't idealize them, I sort of quickly caught myself, because the idealization is not in the heads. So the thing that he will do is, for example, if he's painting a full-length portrait, he makes them much taller than they really are. Now, when we see it, we don't think twice about it, because we think, well, that looks perfectly natural. But if we stopped and really started to question it, we would realize they're taller. Van Dyck does the same thing. If Van Dyck's portrait subjects walked into the room, they'd be 8 feet tall, the way he paints them. The interesting thing about Hals is there's only one existing full-length portrait by Hals. This is very much about Dutch society at that time. There's most of the people in the paintings are Protestants, either Calvinists or Mennonites. So there is a big deal about not showing off, even though they're having these brilliant portraits done, but they're not ostentatious. They're not as subject matter having themselves be put on a pedestal. There's really none of that. Sargent does that. He does kind of put his subjects on a, figuratively speaking, a pedestal of saying he's part of that, again, ancestry to Titian, where, everyone's at their best. And at their best is maybe a little bit better than anybody's ever experienced them. But there's still a fundamental realism behind what Sargent is doing. He's not idealizing people the way Titian does through that filter of aesthetic. He's just using circumstances of how he sets the subjects up to make them feel they're at their best. So the idealization in Sargent is just a nudge here and there.
I agree.
Got time for a few more.
Paul, it's Carolyn.
Hey,
Going back to the rough and the smooth, and maybe this has nothing to do with it, but how often do you use a fan brush? The fan brush.
Yeah, I understand. The fan brush, which I did use, it's around here somewhere. Let's not talk about me. Let's talk about Hals. How often would Hals use the fan brush?
Okay, yeah.
Because I use it sometimes. But I think with Hals, as I said, to examine Hals' portraits close up, it's very clear where he does use the fan brush. He doesn't try to hide that at all. We would never see that in a Van Dyck or a Titian. The evidence of that fan brush stroke. And again, it's not because they're embarrassed about it. It just, they wouldn't think of having that there. You just don't leave that behind. But with Hals, he does, because he's sort of engaging in this high wire act. You know, it's like, look what I can do without being vain. He's again, it's like a tremendous violinist, you know, going through a run or an attack on a certain part of the music, where you're just kind of dazzled with how fast and accurate and expressive and ferocious they can do it. So he uses the fan brush as a way of preparing for the next stroke. So that, and that's kind of what I was doing up here in the forehead. Well, that's not true. But anyway, there might be a place where he would put something down and know that he needs to draw with the brush on top of that wet bed. So he would take the fan brush and smack it once, you know, maybe lightly, maybe vigorously, to cause that surface to close. It's called closing the surface. Mm-hmm. So that all of a sudden, that wet foundation becomes firm enough to take additional strokes on top of, and have those additional strokes that are going on top fully be distinctive and float above. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. That's how Hals is using the fan brush, and that's the way I would advocate it, using a fan brush in general.
Paul, did you start today with a wet subject?
No, it was fully dry. You know, this, I hadn't worked on it since last week.
Okay.
So next week is the finish of Hals, and the following week will be the start of something different, correct?
Right. So Gail had asked me before if I had a list of what was going to happen each week. I don't. I just never, I have to leave myself room to see what happens to lead into what we're going to discuss next week and what we're going to do. However, I do have a general outline of the sequence of the 4 portraits we're going to copy. Christine's will come after the 4th one. So we're starting with the Frans Hals. Then we're going to go to the Rembrandt, and then the Velázquez, and lastly the Vermeer. That's sort of chronological. The Vermeer is definitely the last of the 4 that was painted. The Velázquez and the Rembrandt self-portrait are probably fairly contemporaneous. I've not looked it up, and I don't really care which one came first. But I feel that because we talked so much about Hals' approach, and Hals is Dutch and Rembrandt is Dutch, that we're going to go straight to the Rembrandt, because then we can still continue to talk about some of the ways that Dutch civil society at that time, and religious, and you know, all that was going on in terms of their wars with Spain and so forth. Not that we're going to go into a lot of Dutch history, but just talk about what made Holland unique at that time as a place where this could happen. It could not have happened in Italy. And so we're going to look at how Holland was a place where individualism was particularly able to thrive, both in terms of the society and in terms of the artistic expression of that society through these profound individual artists. So Hals, then Rembrandt, then Velázquez, then Vermeer. I'm hoping to not spend 3 weeks on each one. We might run out of time for Christine, but so we'll see how that goes. It could be that when we get to the Rembrandt and the Velázquez, that I might work on them a little bit in between, just to do things like, for example, the background, or I don't know what, to just take it a little further along, which won't really prevent you from seeing the progress of the painting, but might take away some of the sort of half steps or intermediary steps between the more significant things that happen in the painting.
Oh, I have a question about, you mentioned, I think it was open work approach. Do you have anything to say about that now that you're at this point, to kind of review the process you went through?
What I was talking about was essentially, it's called open form. Open form versus closed form. So the way to understand this is it's like either you're right-handed or you're left-handed, that you just are. And this is a kind of sensibility that you're born with. So open form means that, which is the way I am, means that I want to get lights and darks to round out whatever volume I'm describing, and then confirm the contour, or have the contour be established by just where the light mass stops, for example. Okay, so great artists who are closed form, great artists who are open form. Closed form would mean if I were drawing this head or achieving my illusion, I want the contour as the thing that gives the form volume. I'm trying to think of examples to illustrate this offhand. Basically the two that Mindy was talking about would be a very good example. If you can think of Ingres portraits, Ingres, the French painter from early 19th century, late 18th century. Ingres is a perfect example of a closed form draftsman. Makes stunningly beautiful contours, and the contour so that a closed form draftsman could get an illusion of volume without any shading. Just by the way they do that line, you can feel the presence of the form. The open form draftsman would work sort of inside out, and without even necessarily confirming the contour, you become aware of the contour just through the way they model what's inside the contour. Okay, so everybody leans one way or another. It's not necessarily fully black and white, but it's just something we have in us. And you don't need to be conscious of it. If you're aware of it, you might begin to see it in yourself, but it is not important to know whether you are this way or not, or one way or the other.
Thanks.
I have a question. It's Terry. So this, I'm just curious. So if you don't finish this in these classes, will you finish this portrait on your own?
Yes, I will. I got this far.
I would love to see it when it's finished.
Well, I have hoped, the COVID has interrupted things, but I have the copies from last semester, and I've got the ones that we'll do here. And that's one of the wonderful things about the show, is it gives me a good reason to go ahead and copy the thing full scale. And then sometime to have an exhibit of all the copies. Don't know whether it could be here in my studio. I don't know, some way, somehow, I would like to do that, because that would be fun to have. I've had an exhibit of copies once, but it was mostly of the copies that I have done in miniature. So to invite, all of you to come and see the paintings you saw on the program in person, it'll happen. It'll happen at some point.
I would love to see that.
I would too.
Or
that would be a fun show to do.
Could even put them online on your website and things.
Well, you could. I mean, they would probably show up better in reproduction than they do on the Zoom platform. But nevertheless, I would like to I would like to see them. And then I would like to be with you all in person, for such an exhibit. But I have to say again, the idea of copying that Rembrandt self-portrait full scale is just such a thrill. I can't wait to do it. And every time I see that thing in the Frick, I think I got to go home and copy it. But then I get home and I think, well, what the hell am I going to do with a 40 by 50 portrait of Rembrandt? Now I got a reason to do it.
Well, when I saw you had that painting, I recognized it from the Frick right away, and I got really excited, Paul.
And the Velasquez is from the Frick too.
Oh, that's exciting, because that's one of my favorite museums. I love going there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's delicious.
It is just so rich. There's just every painting in there is just top shelf.
Yeah.
And they have 3 Vermeers there.
Yes.
That's right.
Museum.
That's right.
Yeah. And you can get very close to them, unlike many of the major art museums. And the concierges are so delighted and so honored to be there. They are as enthusiastic as any I've ever seen. So yes.
You're so right. You're so right. I agree with you completely.
So intimate. It's so
much better than the barns where everything is 10 feet in the air.
Oh yeah.
Well, the thing about the Frick too is it's just the right size. It's not too big or too small. It's just right. And then to see the paintings in furnished rooms, I love that. I kind of like to see the paintings with furnishings as opposed to the museum setting where they are. I love that too. But just I recognize this. I remember being in London, and when I was just after being a student, and a lot of the paintings, the old master paintings, are in these manor houses. So you go to the house, and all the paintings are right where they were when the first owners of the house, or the people who bought the paintings, had set them up. And it's so wonderful to see them in somebody's home, which is really how they were intended when they were painted. Maybe not the Velasquez, because of course he's working for the Spanish court, but certainly paintings like these Dutch paintings were intended for the home, which is another thing I want to talk about, with the Hals and especially with the Rembrandt, that there's a way that with Protestantism in Holland, there was no more church painting. That was not okay anymore. No religious paintings in the churches. It was all, and suddenly, so what were painters going to do? Anything they wanted. They could do portraits, they could do still lifes, they could do landscapes, they could do marinescapes, they could do all these different things that they had never done before on speculation. It wasn't just that paintings were all commissioned by the church or nobility. All of a sudden, you basically have what we have, a middle class, upper middle class buying public who is looking for paintings for their homes, and the artists can paint whatever they want and make it of a scale that is basically, as a critic said, what Rembrandt is doing is taking God out of the church and bringing it to their house. And there's something to that. The profoundness of art is no longer outside of the home. It is an experience to be lived with, and that's different, very different. Was very different.
Well,
and art galleries started at that time. So sorry to interrupt you, but Vermeer was both a painter and a dealer.
Well, I'm very thrilled and very thankful that you started with the Dutch guys, because I'm mad about them. Their faces are the best ever, ever, ever.
Yeah, the other thing, this last thing I'll say about this is that the other fascinating thing about the Dutch painters is this is the only time. If you look before the 17th century or after the 17th century, Dutch painting is just this one moment of 75 years when it happens. I'm not saying there weren't paintings before or after, but the way that it just incredibly flourished during that time, both in the portraits, in the landscapes, in the still lives, was this one shining moment, and then nothing.
Golden age.
Golden age, exactly.
Yeah.
I was reading this morning that the term old masters was first applied to that period of Dutch painters.
Yeah. Well, it's
Okay,
like classical
is there any
music.
more questions? I didn't hear.
Tim?
Did
Paul,
someone have a question?
Paul, this is Ken Mazon. A quick clarification.
Sure.
Do you hear me? Okay, so you're talking about the fan brush. I thought of the fan brush as being to blend two areas of color that are too sharp, perhaps, and make it a smoother transition. But you're saying rather you use the Paul's at least use the fan brush to firm up the surface as opposed to blending the colors?
Well, you could use it for both. The blending in terms of creating, for example, if you wanted to turn a surface, you know, and get great gradation, I don't think the fan brush would do that by itself unless you already had the gradations of color present to be blended. Make sense?
Okay, so
So
Paul's.
in other words, I can't, to give you a real crude example, Ken, we can't put black and white next to each other and blend them to get gray.
No, but if you have two colors that are close, but the edge is too sharp, sometimes you would think, oh, I'll use a fan brush to connect them a little bit, to transition them. But you're saying Paul's didn't use it for that purpose. He used it more just to like firm up the surface, perhaps, to paint on top of it.
No, it's some of both. It's some of both. He would be doing both.
Oh, okay. I didn't think of it as a firming, like what do they call it, knockdown? Almost like a knockdown purpose.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
You, again, just think of that term, closing the surface. If you try it, you'll see what I mean. It suddenly causes the surface to be firm enough to take more paint where it wasn't before that dusting with the fan brush.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Could you show us your palette, please?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
I don't think this is going to be terribly exciting, but there it is. So this is the battlefield after. So here's the black. This was the transparent oxide red. This was the yellow ochre, and here's the white. But you can see it's not prismatic. If you were here when we painted the Bill Scott painting, you know, it was much more prismatic. And here you see what we're after is these very subtle relationships of slightly yellow to slightly blue to slightly red. And then also we're seeing here the difference between the dark darks and the lighter lights.
Right. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So then, Paul, my question following up on the palette is that because at that period in time, they didn't have some of the prismatic colors that we have today?
I don't think so. I don't think so. So if you think of Dutch still life, you know, there's quite a bit of rich color there. Mm-hmm. It's still a matter of the development of the concept of what painting is, so that painting is still indebted to sculpture, especially figuratively. You know, it's hard to say that when we talk about landscape. We can say that with still life, it's still indebted to sculpture, but with portraiture, we can really see it, that
I get.
I'm trying to think. Did Van Dyck may have had a little bit more vivid color in places, but not in a head. So, but I understand your question was this due to just a lack of these colors being available? I don't think so. There could be something to that, but I think you see those rich colors in other places. In drapery, you see it in, again, floral still lives from this period. You see it in some Mannerist painting. So I don't think that that's the reason, as much as the aesthetic concept of painting is still closely tied to, or still just one step away from, sculpture.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, gang, so it is 8 minutes after 12. So we will pause here to resume next week. And anything else I need to tell you? I think that's it.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
all.
I really appreciate you being here. See you
Thank
next
you.
week.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye, Paul.
Bye-bye.
Bye.